let's just talk about the state spending, because as von Hayek is and his Montpellier crew are beginning to seed this idea of neoliberalism, which in some respects also you can see in this country, we call it libertarianism on some level. We have Keynes, who is offering a different vision of the state, but one which at one point, as things get consolidated, starts to exacerbate that inequality problem.
Yeah, so a lot of the kind of debates within economics, and I suppose this was part of why I wrote the book, because I wanted to intervene within these debates. They're pitched as debates between people who want a small state and free markets and people who want a bigger state and more regulated markets. And this was basically the debate between Hayek, the neoliberal, and Keynes, the social democrat, right? And this was the debate that dominated politics during the 20th century. What kind of changed the dynamics was the fact that these different ideological views were kind of connected to class movements. So organized workers picked up Keynes's views and basically said, we're organizing to demand greater levels of state protection for workers, greater regulation of businesses, the management of the business cycle. So they would say it was the role of the state to kind of smooth the business cycle and make sure that periods of unemployment were kind of reduced and take a more active role in the economy. That's the Keynesian view. Whereas the neoliberal view, which was all about, free markets in inverted commas, actually about the state acting in the interests of big business and in the interest of finance, that was obviously ultimately picked up by capital. Lobbying groups and big financial institutions, all of these people who were involved in, as you say, the Montpellier Society, and continue to push governments for these changes to policy. Now, I think what's really interesting about this battle is it defines politics throughout the kind of post-war period. And ultimately, the neoliberals win. In the 1980s, they elect governments like those of Thatcher and Reagan, and the interests of those at the top of the capitalists basically come to dominate. But what also happens when the neoliberals come to power is that they use that state power to crush and fragment the working class power that had previously led us to have these much more kind of interventionist governments that had greater levels of spending on public services, that invested more in the economy. And they did this in a number of different ways. Firstly, obviously, they crushed the unions. So in the UK, for example, you had the miners' strike, which was crushed brutally by Margaret Thatcher, miners literally beaten up everywhere, anti-union legislation, privatization of state-owned industries where the labor movement was strong. And then, and this is the interesting thing, you also had this kind of revolution in the way that people see themselves and the way that they see society. Thatcher said, the method is economics, the object is to change the soul. She wanted to undermine these kind of cooperative instincts that people had and that had underpinned everything that workers had won, from the New Deal in the US to the NHS in the UK to workers' rights to the weekend to whatever. That all came from workers coming together and organizing collectively to take on the interests of those at the top. What neoliberalism did was said, you shouldn't cooperate. That's not natural. That's not normal. You should compete with each other, because that's how human beings are built. And we're going to create all these institutions that force you to compete with one another, because you can't join a union. You can't work together to demand a higher wage from your boss. So what are you going to do? You're going to work harder. You're going to say, right, if I need a pay increase, I have to basically elbow everyone around me out of the way to get that. If I don't get it, then I'm going to blame myself and internalize the idea that I'm useless because I'm not paid as much as anyone else around me. And that creates this really powerful ideological mechanism that legitimizes the whole system, because you stop blaming those at the top for things that have gone wrong. You stop cooperating with people around you to try and hold them to account. And instead you blame yourself and you compete with everyone else.
And talk about how, which I found fascinating, and I've only really seen it in, I don't know if you've seen those Adam Curtis documentaries, but in Hypernormalization, like that concept of you're going through the 60s, and you're having these emancipatory movements that are both broadly emancipatory. We had the Civil Rights Act in this country. We had, first wave of feminism, and commensurate sort of rights that were expanded up into, what basically a white guy got in our society, whether it was voting, whether it was like the ability for women to have their own credit card, and that emancipatory movement, which also sort of went down to the individual. You don't conform, you liberate yourself. You can, grow your hair as long as you want. You can wear whatever. That impulse was hijacked and extended into what you're talking about with this competitive nature.
Yeah. That is a big part of it. I think what is really significant when you look back now as to how that culture was embedded, it was with both carrot and stick. So there was the stick of, the ways in which those movements were crushed, beaten, made illegal. Today we're seeing demonstrators all over the world being put in prison for peaceful protests. That's the legacy of that kind of movement against popular power. But there was this really powerful stick element of it too, which was basically, how do we turn people into mini capitalists? How do we convince workers that they're not workers with something in common with other workers? They are investors or they're entrepreneurs, right? And both Reagan and Thatcher did this really successfully through a number of different mechanisms. Firstly, there was this big boom in real estate, and they deregulated the finance sector so that loads of people could buy their own houses. And then all of that money that was being created by the financial sector would get pumped into the housing market, push up house prices. Suddenly you have people with loads and loads of wealth in their homes thinking, wow, I'm a really successful and intelligent investor. You also privatize people's pensions and get them to invest in the stock market. So that again links their sense of prosperity to financial interests and to the interests of capital more generally. They start to see themselves as mini capitalists again. And then you have these, big movements in education as well, where we are encouraged to think of getting an education as investing in our human capital, as much as, a business that wants to invest in its capital takes out a loan to build a new factory. As a human being, you think, I'm not getting education to kind of broaden my horizons or learn something new or get a better job. I'm investing in myself as a little piece of capital. So I'm taking out a loan, buying a degree, and then leveraging that to achieve success later in life. All of these things really encouraged the idea that, you are not a worker. You are this little individual entrepreneur, and it's your job to balance your assets and your liabilities, to take out debt, and to use that to acquire assets, to invest in the stock market, and just generally to kind of identify with the interests of those exploiting you effectively. And it was not only effective because some people did get lots of wealth, and so everyone else looked at those people and thought, well, that could be me. It was much deeper than that. It was, when you see yourself as one little business competing with all these other little businesses, it deeply undermines anyone's sense of solidarity. And it's so ingrained now. If you think about young people, particularly on social media, right? There's this whole
social
idea
media is a complete training ground to develop your personal brand. I mean,
exactly.
It's however many likes, it could be substituted with, I've made $10,000 or whatever it is. And it's just, yes, it's like Vegas for kids, essentially, on some level. Well, I want to talk about before we get to sort of you provide both examples of the tendency of monopolization under this system. And it's sort of it was for a long time completely shrouded in this country in a redefinition that came out of the Chicago school, Milton Friedman, and it was Robert Bork in this instance, a redefinition of what constituted an unfair monopoly. It narrowed what how it was measured to just the question of, does it lower prices, even though very often ultimately it did not lower prices. But by narrowing the what constituted the qualifications for a monopoly. We had a 40, 50-year stretch in this country anyways of mergers, acquisitions, consolidation, whatnot. It has changed under the Biden administration. There's a lot of questions as to whether it will continue in the same fashion under the Harris administration. But you walk through and you give several examples of these things: Ford Motor Company, Amazon, the financialization, the banks in the wake of the TARP. Let me ask you this relative to the question of antitrust policy in a broad sense. The idea that we need to democratize things more, both in terms of smaller firms having more opportunity to compete, that you don't have the bar to entry is so high. Also, what it does for democracy, you don't have an Amazon or an Elon Musk or, a Boeing that can dictate the policy of our government. How do you sequence this? Because, I've just, it's small bore stuff, but there has been, an interesting argument between people who I think more identify with socialism and social democracy, and those who are more capitalist but believe that the market is encumbered by monopolization and financialization.
Mm.
How do you reconcile those two things? Are those things at odds with each other? Do you see them as a sequencing? What's your perspective on that?
So I don't really believe that it's possible to have a market without concentration and monopoly. And this is an argument that Marx actually made when he talked about the development of capitalism. He said that there was an inherent tendency towards the centralization of capital, so a smaller number of businesses producing more stuff. And there's lots of reasons for that. The most obvious is that, as capitalism develops, technology becomes more sophisticated and more stuff, more resources, more capital, more money is required just to produce the kinds of things we take for granted. Take, for example, the airline industry. You couldn't just set up a competitor for Boeing overnight because the capital, in every sense of the word, that's required to start a business like that is so huge. And that is an inherent tendency that takes place over the course of the development of capitalism.
But you could have a regulatory regime like we used to have in this country, where we had, literally dozens more airlines prior to deregulation, where you could basically impose a set of restrictions that say it's impossible for you to amass this. And we're going to create a situation where the bar to entry is going to be lower, and we're going to cause you to break up. We may see this with Google. Is there from a socialist perspective value in that step? And if so, why?
Great question. And it really comes down to a kind of chicken and egg problem, which is about why does the capitalist state do what it does? Now, the kind of socialist answer to this question is that governments implement progressive policies when they're forced to, because the balance of class power is such that they don't have a choice, right? Now, if you look at, yes, the New Deal and also all of the kind of original antitrust, laws that came before that, this set of policies was developed in a very, very different world than the one we have today. They were developed in a world of, firstly, substantial working class power. Secondly, the kind of geopolitical conflict that required the government to kind of take a bigger steps to intervene in the economy, basically. And if you look at progressive economic and social policy in the US in particular, it emerges from this combination of the government wants the economy to be working effectively and to be, relatively just because it's fighting a war, and workers want their fair share. So these external conditions, some internal conditions, come together to give us this set of progressive legislation. Now, if we look at the situation today, it's very different because worker power, whilst it is building, And we are seeing greater levels of unionization and those sorts of things. It's nowhere near at the point that we saw, in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. So the government is not beholden to any interests other than basically those of big business and of different sections of capital. So if you look at the Democrats and the Republicans, for example, why do they do what they do? Well, the Republicans are basically completely in the pockets of a certain subset of very, very extractive capitalists. So we're thinking particularly of, historically that's been fossil fuels, finance, etc. Now increasingly tech as well. Whereas the Democrats have this broader view as to how to make capitalism work over the long run. And these are basically debates that take place amongst the capitalist class. It's like, do we take everything we can and run right now, or do we try and create a system that allows us to maintain our profits over the long run? And what Biden and others saw was that if you have an economy which becomes so drastically unfair, so intensely concentrated that small businesses can't compete, that workers aren't getting their fair share, and that basically oligarchs are controlling politics and running off with tons of money, that system isn't going to survive very long. So it's a kind of self-interested attempt to make that system function more effectively. It was never going to go particularly far because, again, he still has to answer to the interests of the people who are basically, influencing what he does more than anyone, which is corporate interests. So the socialist argument isn't that we shouldn't have antitrust. It's not that, we shouldn't have greater levels of taxation, regulation, etc. It's that to get there, we need to be able to really build class power and to force politicians to listen to the people. I like to say that our job as socialists is to make politicians as scared of the people voting for them as the ones writing the checks. And, we're a bit of a long way off from that right now.
I mean, I get it. What do you think of the idea that as obviously neither of those approaches are mutually exclusive. And what do you think of the argument that a strong antitrust regime and the attendant regulatory state that gets more robust? Again, I think we're probably going to go away from that. Hopefully not, but we'll see. Because there's some who argue that, Joe Biden was actually is old enough to be pre-neoliberal when that turn happened. But what do you think of the argument that in inhibiting the wealth concentration and then the subsequent political power concentration of some of these major capitalists, you provide more room for workers to grow their power, right? Like, I mean, if Sheldon Adelson didn't have hundreds of, have billions of dollars, his ability to undermine unions would be less so. Same with Boeing, same with, and if there's multiple, you have a monopsony with a lot of these companies. And so their monopoly is not just in marketplace of what they sell, but their monopoly is also in when they hire. What do you think of that argument in terms of a sequencing, right? Where it's like, which is not to say you can't do both simultaneously and that you shouldn't, but
I think it makes sense. The question is, are politicians going to do these things? If they do, for whatever reason, decide to, as Biden did, implement, slightly more effective antitrust policy, then you can see on both a theoretical and a practical level how that would change things. Yes, it creates space for worker organizing. It potentially boosts worker power relative to capital. But if you think about that from the perspective of an organizer, of someone who's trying to get workers together within a Boeing or, even within a tech company, for example, where workers, again, have been trying to organize, they see this opening and the fact that this company is now being attacked on a different front. And they can say, right, we now have more power to be able to hold this company to account. The issue is whether or not that organizing actually happens. And that's why I think, certainly when I think about, the socialist argument on a lot of these things here in Europe, but I think it's true in the US as well, is that you can't just have a battle that's going on within political institutions, because it's going to be dominated by vested interests no matter what. There has to also be this battle that's taking place in workplaces and on the streets to hold those politicians to account.
Let's we don't have too much time, but let's talk about, as part of your book is dedicated to sort of expanding people's imagination as to what an alternative system could be, which is hugely important. I mean, we've heard this time and time again on this program. A plan beats no plan. And you're not going to have a plan unless you have a vision of these things. One of the things that I think, I mean, I'm old enough to have, to remember what Iceland did in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. Maybe we can talk about that. But also I want to touch on Lucas Aerospace, because I don't know that anybody knows about that in this country. But talk about Iceland, because this also goes to the idea of having a plan and being able to roll it out in those moments of crisis.
Yeah, so Iceland was really screwed over by the financial crisis, basically. It had been this kind of small fishing economy that had created a niche for itself as a massive financial services producer, effectively, in the run-up to the financial crisis. So it had these huge banks that were kind of many times bigger than the actual economy. And then the meltdown happened and the banks went under. And as happened in many other places, the government was expected to be responsible, but couldn't ultimately bail out the banks. There was a referendum which made this different in Iceland as to basically what to do next, as to whether or not taxpayers would be on the hook for the liabilities of these banks. And there was this big referendum campaign, and a kind of new political party emerged through this, and the no campaign won. So basically the people of Iceland said, we're not going to just bail out the banks, and we're not just going to pay for this. We want a different kind of economic model. And a new political party was elected after this referendum on a platform of basically kind of promoting economic democracy. And there were some really interesting experiments that were going on locally and that took place in kind of the 2010s that were about putting this idea of economic democracy into practice. So in Reykjavik, the capital of Iceland, there was this idea of the kind of Better Reykjavik program, where it was almost a form of participatory budgeting. Basically, citizens got to vote on how local government budgets would be used. And they ended up obviously voting for things that were relatively progressive, that were good for the climate, that were good for kind of homeless people, that gave them better public services. And it really kind of embedded this culture of making democracy real, basically at the local level. And you see this in the participatory budgeting movement all over the world, because it spreads everywhere. This is happening in South America, in Brazil. There's loads of local governments that give local people the opportunity to kind of vote on how their budget is spent. You see it in Spain, you see it in Canada, all these different places. Again, it's about making democracy real at the local level. And I included that in the book because I think it's a really good example of how community organizing, as well as labor organizing and kind of, protest, can have a really significant effect on, people's sense of what democracy means. And it cuts through this individualism thing that I was talking about earlier, this idea that we all have to compete against each other. As soon as you start showing people that when they collaborate and work together, things can change, suddenly their whole world opens up. And it becomes much easier to think about joining a union or joining a protest.
Now, Reykjavik, obviously much smaller than, scale than, frankly, either Great Britain or the U.S. But what was there an intellectual movement, a social movement that pre-existed, that was ready to sort of like fill the vacuum that came in the wake of this crisis?
Yeah, so this participatory budgeting movement actually emerged in Brazil in the 1980s, in really quite big towns and cities across the country. And it was part of the kind of left-wing party coming to power at the local level. Their whole idea, as a kind of socialist party that, became less socialist as it got closer to power. But initially, the whole idea was we want electoral power, But that's not going to be enough, because as soon as we get into the state, we're going to have capitalists coming for us everywhere. We're going to have to be fighting battles on at every corner. So they thought that, well, they knew that they had to build a base, a foundation of popular power. And they were doing this anyway with the unions. But this whole idea of participatory budgeting was about, how do we build a base of community power so that people are engaged in this project? They feel an immediate sense of ownership, and they start to kind of build movements at their local level that can kind of act as, as this foundation that can underpin the project as it gets attacked from all these different angles. And this is really important. You know, in the UK, for example, we had this movement to get Jeremy Corbyn as leader of the Labour Party and then to become Prime Minister. And what was really interesting about that was because so many of the social movements and the unions that would have been involved in that project had been beaten back by over decades and decades and decades. That social base didn't exist. You know, the things I write about now are about, why are more people not resisting capitalism? Why are more people not on strike? Why are more people not protesting? It's not because they don't care. It's not because they're not worried about the state of the planet. It's because they can't imagine what it would be like to protest, because this idea of individualism and competition is so deeply embedded. So these movements, like the participatory budgeting movement, like the labor movement, like all these social movements we have at the moment, it's not just about winning power and, like, you know, achieving particular campaign goals. It's about cutting through our sense that we are all alone.
Tell us about Lucas Aerospace.
This is my favorite example, actually, and I think it's one of the examples that illustrates this point about cooperation versus competitive individualism the most effectively. Because I gave you the example of Boeing already, which is this massive, you know, modern aerospace company. Lucas Aerospace existed in the 1970s in the UK. And it had been pretty successful, but there was growing competition from abroad, and it looked like the firm was going to go under. So the workers at Lucas Aerospace went to the government and said, we need you to nationalize us. And a government minister at the time, Tony Benn, said, well, we can't do that. So you guys need to come up with a plan as to how you're going to save this company. So the workers, the unionists who were involved in this, went to the workers and said, what can we do with this firm? How can we save it? And what they came up with, all of these workers together from all across this company, they all submitted ideas as to how they could transform Lucas Aerospace from a weapons manufacturer to a manufacturer of socially useful technologies. They also submitted ideas as to how it could be run democratically, how it could become a kind of worker-owned, democratically governed corporation that, again, produced things like wind turbines, healthcare tech, and used the resources that were in the firm now to produce weapons to make that transition. And this plan was published, and it was greeted with kind of astonishment and amazement across not just the left, but even the kind of mainstream, like, you know, the Financial Times and MPs and people from kind of within the capitalist class looked at this and they said, wow, these workers that we thought were just stupid and just had to take orders, they really know a thing or two about how to govern themselves and how to kind of produce things. Now, ultimately, what happened was that this plan was developed in 1979. Thatcher was elected, and she crushed this movement. You know, this whole thing about like free markets and giving people freedom. You're only allowed your freedom if you exercise it in the right ways. If it's a freedom to consume, basically, or a freedom to compete, not when it's a freedom to cooperate. And these workers basically were crushed and the plan didn't go anywhere. So what happened instead was that Lucas Aerospace was carved up in the shareholder value revolution of the 1980s. Bits of it were sold off. And what I found in the research for my book is that parts of what was once Lucas Aerospace had been bought by a company that made the inputs that were sold to Boeing that caused the plane to crash. I think this is such a powerful indicator of the two roots that we had as a society, that we still have as a society, which is basically corporate dominance or democratic governance of the economy. And one of them gives us planes that fall out of the sky. The other one gives us powerful, confident, self-organized workers producing socially useful technologies.
Grace Blakeley, writer at the Tribune. The book is Vulture Capitalism, Corporate Crimes, Backdoor Bailouts, and the Death of Freedom. Thanks so much. Really fascinating read, and a great primer on the dynamics really that have taken place over the past 50, 60 years in both our countries. Really appreciate you coming on.
It was great. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.